Have you ever felt a strange coincidence that seemed too perfect to be random? Or perhaps you've experienced an unexpected peace during your most troubled times. What if I told you these aren't just random events, but actually signs that God is trying to communicate with you? Today, we'll explore the 3 miraculous signs that Pope John Paul II revealed as divine communication, and how recognizing these signs can transform your spiritual life, bring financial wisdom, and improve your health. Imagine waking up every morning feeling lost, like something important is missing from your life. This was exactly what happened to Maria, a dedicated teacher who had everything she thought she needed: a stable job, a comfortable home, and good health. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She prayed regularly, but felt like her prayers were hitting a ceiling. Was God listening? Did he care about her struggles? Maria's turning point came when she stumbled upon a collection of teachings from Pope John Paul II about divine communication. As she began to understand the signs the beloved Pope had spoken about, she started noticing patterns in her own life, moments where God had been trying to reach her all along. What she discovered not only deepened her faith, but also brought unexpected wisdom to her financial decisions and renewed her approach to health. Today, I'm going to share these 3 miraculous signs with you, just as Pope John Paul II revealed them. And before I continue, if you're enjoying this content and want more spiritual wisdom that can transform your life, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue sharing these life-changing messages, and I'd love to know which parts of the world our community comes from. The first miraculous sign that God is trying to communicate with you is through unexpected synchronicities, or divine coincidences. These are events that seem too perfectly timed or arranged to be mere chance. Pope John Paul II often spoke about how God works through the ordinary events of our lives, creating extraordinary moments of clarity. For Maria, this happened when she was struggling with a major financial decision. Should she invest her savings in a new opportunity or keep them secure? After praying about it without receiving any clear answer, she randomly met an old friend at the grocery store, someone she hadn't seen in years. This friend happened to be a financial advisor who offered her exactly the guidance she needed, without Maria ever mentioning her dilemma. Pope John Paul II taught that these divine coincidences aren't random at all. In his wisdom, he explained that God often speaks to us through other people, placing them in our path at precisely the right moment. Coincidence is what we call it when God chooses to remain anonymous, he would say. These synchronicities can appear in many forms: a book falling open to exactly the page you needed to read, meeting someone who has the answer to a problem you've been struggling with, or hearing the same message from multiple unrelated sources within a short time. But how can you tell if a coincidence is truly divine communication? Pope John Paul II gave us 3 indicators. First, it feels meaningful rather than merely random. Second, it addresses something you've been praying about or needing guidance on. And third, it brings a sense of peace or clarity. This type of divine communication doesn't just impact our spiritual lives. Maria found that by paying attention to these synchronicities, her financial decisions became wiser. She learned to pause before making important financial choices, creating space for divine guidance to enter. This practice saved her from several potentially costly mistakes and led her toward opportunities that brought both prosperity and purpose. Similarly, she noticed improvements in her physical health as she became more attuned to these divine coincidences. On several occasions, she felt mysteriously drawn to articles or conversations about specific health practices that later proved to be exactly what her body needed. One such coincidence led her to discover an anti-inflammatory diet that resolved digestive issues she'd struggled with for years. The second miraculous sign that God is trying to speak to you comes through inner peace during turmoil. Pope John Paul II lived through some of history's darkest moments, including Nazi occupation and communist rule in Poland. Through these experiences, he came to recognize that one of God's most powerful forms of communication is the gift of inexplicable peace during times of great difficulty. When you suddenly feel a calm assurance in the midst of a storm, he taught, this is often God speaking directly to your heart. For Maria, this sign manifested during a health crisis. When she received concerning test results that required further investigation, instead of being consumed by worry, as was her usual response, she felt a strange, overwhelming sense of peace. This wasn't denial or avoidance. She still took all the necessary medical steps, but the panic and anxiety she expected simply weren't there. This peace sustained her through weeks of uncertainty, and when she eventually received a clean bill of health, she recognized that God had been communicating with her all along, assuring her that regardless of the outcome, she would be held in divine love. Pope John Paul II explained that this peace differs from ordinary calmness in several ways. It often comes when peace makes no logical sense given the circumstances. It transcends understanding, as Scripture says. And importantly, it doesn't remove the challenge, but provides strength to face it. This divine peace can also guide our financial decisions in surprising ways. Maria noticed that when considering certain financial opportunities, despite promising returns, she felt an inexplicable unease. Learning to trust this inner guidance saved her from investments that later proved problematic. Conversely, some opportunities that seemed modest brought that sense of peace, and while they didn't make her wealthy overnight, they provided steady, sustainable growth that better aligned with her values. Regarding health, Pope John Paul II frequently taught that emotional peace and physical well-being are deeply connected. Modern medicine now confirms what spiritual traditions have long known. Chronic stress and anxiety can compromise our immune systems and contribute to numerous health problems. By recognizing and trusting God's communication through peace, Maria found that her sleep improved, her blood pressure normalized, and her overall resilience increased. This brings us to the third miraculous sign: persistent thoughts or ideas that won't leave you alone. Pope John Paul II described this as holy persistence, when a particular thought, idea, or direction keeps returning to your mind, especially during prayer or quiet moments. Unlike random thoughts that flit through our consciousness, these persistent ideas have a different quality. They don't create anxiety, but rather a gentle, consistent pull in a certain direction. They often align with spiritual values rather than mere self-interest, and typically they don't disappear with time, but become clearer and more defined. Maria experienced this when she kept having thoughts about starting a support group for teachers struggling with burnout. Initially, she dismissed the idea. She was busy enough already, but the thought wouldn't leave her alone. During prayer, while falling asleep, even during her morning coffee, this idea kept resurfacing with increasing clarity. When she finally acted on this persistent thought, not only did she help many colleagues find renewed purpose and joy in their profession, but she also discovered unexpected benefits in her own life. The leadership skills she developed through running the group later opened doors for advancement in her career, bringing financial benefits she hadn't anticipated. Additionally, the meaningful connections she formed through the group became a vital support system that enhanced her emotional well-being. Pope John Paul II cautioned that discernment is essential when evaluating persistent thoughts. Not every recurring idea is divine communication. He provided 3 criteria for discernment. Does the thought align with Scripture and church teaching? Does it promote love, peace, and the good of others rather than just self-interest? And when you tentatively move in that direction, do you experience fruits like peace, joy, and increased faith. The integration of these three signs, divine coincidences, peace during turmoil, and holy persistence, creates a powerful framework for recognizing God's communication in our lives. When Maria began to notice and respond to these signs, she experienced transformation not just spiritually, but in all areas of her life. Financially, she developed what Pope John Paul II called providential economics, an approach to money that balances prudent stewardship with radical trust in divine provision. She learned to save wisely while remaining generous, to work diligently while maintaining proper perspective about material wealth, and to see financial resources as tools for purpose rather than sources of security. In terms of health, her increased attentiveness to divine communication led her to a more integrated approach to well-being. Pope John Paul II often spoke about the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit, emphasizing that physical care has spiritual significance. Maria found that as her spiritual awareness deepened, she naturally made healthier choices, not from strict discipline or fear, but from a place of reverence and gratitude for the gift of her body. But perhaps most importantly, recognizing these three signs transformed Maria's spiritual life. She no longer felt that her prayers were hitting a ceiling. Instead, she began to experience her relationship with God as a genuine two-way conversation. This awareness brought a depth and richness to her faith that she had never known before. As we conclude this first part of our exploration into the miraculous signs of divine communication, I invite you to reflect on your own life. Have you experienced any divine coincidences recently? Can you recall times when you felt an inexplicable peace despite difficult circumstances? Are there any persistent thoughts that might be more than just random ideas? God is constantly trying to communicate with us. The question is, are we paying attention? In our next segment, we'll explore practical ways to become more attuned to these divine signs and how to respond when you recognize them in your life. But first, let me know if these signs resonate with your own experience. Have you noticed God trying to speak to you through any of these ways? Welcome back to our exploration of the three miraculous signs that Pope John Paul II revealed about divine communication. In our first segment, we learned about divine coincidences, peace during turmoil, and holy persistence. Now let's dive deeper into how we can become more receptive to these signs and what to do when we recognize them. Maria's story continues with an important lesson. Despite beginning to recognize these divine signs, she still struggled with how to respond to them. "It's one thing to notice God trying to communicate," she told her spiritual director, "but it's another thing entirely to know what to do with that awareness." Her spiritual director shared a teaching from Pope John Paul II that transformed her approach. The beloved Pope taught that divine communication isn't just about receiving messages. It's about entering into a relationship. Just as any meaningful relationship requires both listening and responding, our connection with God follows the same pattern. One morning, while praying, Maria felt a strong impression to reach out to a former colleague who had left teaching due to health issues. The thought was persistent, falling into the category of the third sign we discussed. Though hesitant, Maria remembered Pope John Paul II's words about taking small steps of obedience when we sense divine guidance. She called her former colleague and discovered that this person had been in a deep depression, feeling forgotten and purposeless. Their conversation became a turning point, not just for her colleague who felt seen and valued again, but also for Maria, who experienced the joy that comes from responding to divine prompting. This experience taught Maria that responding to God's communication often begins with simple obedience in small matters. Pope John Paul II called this the spirituality of the next right thing, not needing to see the entire path ahead, but simply taking the next step that aligns with divine guidance. Interestingly, this principle applies powerfully to financial wisdom as well. Many people feel overwhelmed by financial planning, believing they need to have their entire financial future mapped out perfectly. But Pope John Paul II's teaching on responding to divine guidance offers a more sustainable approach. Faithful stewardship of what we have today, combined with openness to divine direction for tomorrow. Maria applied this to her finances by setting aside time each month to review her resources and prayerfully consider how they should be allocated. Rather than making financial decisions based solely on spreadsheets or what financial experts recommended, she integrated prayer and attention to divine signs into her process. This didn't mean abandoning practical wisdom. In fact, Pope John Paul II emphasized that divine guidance typically works in harmony with, not opposition to, sound practical knowledge. This balanced approach led Maria to make monthly donations to causes that aligned with her values, even when conventional financial wisdom might have suggested saving every penny. Remarkably, she found that this practice of generous giving didn't diminish her resources, but somehow expanded them. Not always in direct financial returns, but often through unexpected opportunities, timely assistance when needed, or reduced expenses in other areas. In terms of health, this responsiveness to divine communication led Maria to a more intuitive approach to well-being. Pope John Paul II, despite his own physical challenges later in life, exemplified attention to bodily needs without obsession over physical limitations. Maria learned to listen to her body with the same attentiveness she was developing in her spiritual life. This meant noticing when she needed rest rather than pushing through exhaustion. It meant recognizing which foods gave her energy and which left her feeling depleted. It meant moving her body in ways that brought joy rather than following exercise regimens that felt punishing. This attentiveness, inspired by divine guidance, led to sustainable health practices rather than short-term fixes. But perhaps the most profound change in Maria's life came through what Pope John Paul II called the discipline of sacred awareness. This practice involves setting aside specific times each day to reflect on where and how God might be communicating. Each evening before bed, Maria would take 10 minutes to review her day, asking herself 3 questions derived from Pope John Paul II's teachings. Did I experience any meaningful coincidences today? Were there moments of unexpected peace? Did any particular thoughts or ideas persist throughout my day? Over time, this simple practice dramatically increased her ability to recognize divine communication in real time, not just in retrospect. She began to notice patterns, certain qualities that distinguish divine guidance from ordinary thoughts or emotions. Pope John Paul II taught that divine communication typically has several distinguishing characteristics. First, it brings clarity rather than confusion. Second, it leads toward love rather than fear. Third, it often comes with a sense of expansion, a feeling that new possibilities are opening up rather than closing down. Maria found this framework incredibly helpful in discerning which inner promptings to follow and which to question. When considering a potential career change that promised higher income but would require compromising some of her core values, she initially felt conflicted. Applying these discernment principles, she recognized that the opportunity, despite its financial appeal, brought confusion rather than clarity and constriction rather than expansion. This doesn't mean that divine guidance always leads to comfortable choices. In fact, Pope John Paul II often emphasized that authentic divine communication sometimes calls us toward challenging paths that require courage and sacrifice. The key distinction is that even when the path is difficult, True divine guidance brings an underlying sense of rightness and peace about the direction, even if apprehension about the challenges remains. For example, when Maria felt called to start a support program for struggling students that would require significant time investment without additional compensation, she felt both nervous about the commitment and deeply peaceful about the decision. This combination of practical concern with underlying peace often signals authentic divine guidance. Financially, Maria learned that this same pattern applied. Authentic financial wisdom inspired by divine guidance might sometimes call for risky moves or generous giving that conventional financial advisors might question. Yet these decisions, when truly aligned with divine communication, bring that same combination of practical consideration with underlying peace. Pope John Paul II taught that God is intimately concerned with our material needs, not just our spiritual development. Jesus himself spent considerable time addressing questions of resources, stewardship, and provision. Divine guidance in financial matters doesn't mean we'll always be led toward prosperity, but it does mean we'll be led toward provision, purpose, and peace, regardless of our material circumstances. Another powerful insight from Pope John Paul II that transformed Maria's receptivity to divine communication was his teaching on the role of community. He emphasized that while God speaks to us directly, these messages are often confirmed and clarified through our faith community. When Maria began sensing a call to develop a new approach to teaching that incorporated more spiritual principles, she didn't rely solely on her own discernment. Following Pope John Paul II's wisdom, she shared these thoughts with trusted, spiritual companions who could help her test the authenticity of this guidance. Some of her friends expressed enthusiasm and encouragement, seeing alignment between her gifts and this new direction. Others asked thoughtful questions that helped refine and clarify what she was hearing. One mentor gently pointed out aspects of the vision that might need reconsideration. Through this community discernment process, what had started as a vague, inner prompting developed into a clear and practical vision. This communal aspect of discerning divine communication applies to financial decisions as well. Pope John Paul II taught that while our culture often treats financial matters as strictly private, Christian tradition has always recognized the wisdom of seeking counsel and maintaining accountability in how we use our resources. Maria began meeting quarterly with a small group of trusted friends who shared her values, discussing financial decisions and seeking wisdom together. This practice protected her from both impulsive spending and fearful hoarding, helping her maintain a balanced approach to resources that honored both prudence and generosity. In terms of health, this community dimension proved equally valuable. Rather than following every health trend or restricting herself to conventional medical wisdom alone, Maria developed relationships with several health-minded individuals who shared her integrated spiritual perspective. Together, they exchanged insights about nutrition, movement, rest, and other aspects of physical stewardship, always connecting these topics to larger questions of purpose and spiritual well-being. Pope John Paul II particularly emphasized the importance of this integrated approach to health. He rejected both the materialistic view that reduces humans to merely physical beings and the over-spiritualized view that neglects bodily needs. Instead, he taught that authentic spirituality embraces our whole being, body, mind, and spirit, recognizing that God communicates with and through each dimension. For Maria, this meant recognizing that her physical symptoms sometimes carried spiritual messages. Recurring headaches prompted her to examine sources of stress and unresolved conflicts. Digestive issues led her to consider not just her diet, but also whether she was properly digesting emotional experiences. Fatigue raised questions about both her sleep habits and whether her work and activities truly aligned with her purpose. This holistic awareness represents what Pope John Paul II called the sanctified body. Not a perfect body by cultural standards, but a body that is listened to, respected, and understood as an important aspect of our spiritual journey. Through this lens, even health challenges can become opportunities for deeper communion with God. As Maria integrated these practices more fully into her life, she began to experience what Pope John Paul II described as living in divine dialogue, a state where awareness of God's communication becomes so natural that it infuses every aspect of daily life. This didn't mean she received dramatic revelations or mystical experiences regularly. More often, divine communication came through subtle impressions, gentle redirections, or simple affirmations. The extraordinary aspect wasn't the form of the communication, but the growing certainty that she wasn't navigating life alone, that divine wisdom and love were constantly available to guide her. This awareness transformed even mundane activities. Grocery shopping became an opportunity to practice presence and gratitude. Work challenges became invitations to seek divine wisdom rather than relying solely on her own capabilities. Financial planning became an exercise in discerning purpose and priorities rather than merely maximizing returns. Pope John Paul II described this state as ordinary mysticism, the profound recognition of divine presence and communication in the most common elements of human experience. This perspective doesn't require dramatic spiritual experiences, but rather a refined attention to the ways God is already speaking through our daily lives. For Maria, one of the most significant aspects of this journey was learning that divine communication often comes through unlikely sources. Pope John Paul II frequently emphasized that God speaks not just through scripture, prayer, and religious authorities, but also through nature, art, children, strangers, and even our own bodies. One day, while struggling with an important decision about whether to invest a significant amount of money in additional education, Maria took a walk in a nearby park. As she sat watching children play, she noticed how freely they moved from one activity to another, fully engaged yet unattached to outcomes. Something about their way of being spoke directly to her dilemma, suggesting an approach to her decision that balanced commitment with openness to changing course if needed. This experience exemplified Pope John Paul II's teaching that divine wisdom is woven throughout creation, available to those with eyes to see and ears to hear. By expanding her understanding of how and where God communicates, Maria discovered guidance in unexpected places. As we conclude this second segment of our exploration, I invite you to consider how you might become more receptive to divine communication in your own life. What practices might help you notice the three miraculous signs we've discussed? How might attentiveness to divine guidance transform your approach to spirituality, finances, and health? In our final segment, we'll explore how recognizing and responding to divine communication can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, bringing healing and renewal to our fragmented world. We'll also address how to maintain this divine dialogue during periods of spiritual dryness when God seems silent. But before we continue, I'd love to hear your experiences with divine communication. Have you developed any practices that help you recognize when God is speaking to you? We've journeyed together through the three miraculous signs that Pope John Paul II revealed about divine communication and explored how to become more receptive to God's guidance. In this final segment, we'll discover how recognizing these signs can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, and how to maintain this divine dialogue even during spiritual dry seasons. Maria's story takes an unexpected turn as we enter this chapter. After several years of developing her ability to recognize divine communication, she faced what spiritual writers have called the dark night of the soul, a period where God seemed absent and silent. The synchronicities, inner peace, and persistent thoughts that had guided her seemed to vanish, leaving her feeling spiritually adrift. During this challenging time, Maria discovered another profound teaching from Pope John Paul II about divine communication. Sometimes the apparent silence itself is the message. The beloved Pope, who experienced his own spiritual deserts, taught that these periods of seeming divine absence serve essential purposes in our spiritual maturation. In the silence, he wrote in one of his personal reflections, we learn to seek God for himself alone, rather than for the comfort his communication brings us. This insight transformed Maria's understanding of her spiritual desert. Rather than frantically searching for signs or questioning her previous experiences, she began to embrace the silence as its own form of divine communication. This period taught Maria about the difference between spiritual consolation and spiritual maturity. While recognizing divine signs had brought her comfort and guidance, true spiritual growth required developing faith that remained steady even when these consolations were withdrawn. Pope John Paul II compared this to the development of a child who initially needs constant reassurance from parents, but gradually develops the confidence to act independently while still maintaining the relationship. Surprisingly, this apparent setback in her spiritual journey brought unexpected benefits to her financial life. During her dark night, Maria realized she had sometimes used divine guidance as a way to avoid making difficult financial decisions herself. The silence forced her to develop greater financial discernment and responsibility while still maintaining an underlying trust in divine provision. She began setting clearer financial boundaries, creating more structured savings plans, and making decisions based on well-defined values rather than waiting for specific divine signs. Paradoxically, this more proactive approach didn't replace trust in divine guidance, but actually deepened it, shifting from dependence on particular signs to confidence in the wisdom she had already received. In terms of health, the spiritual desert similarly led to greater integration. Rather than seeking specific divine guidance for each health decision, Maria developed a more holistic understanding of well-being that honored both divine wisdom and practical knowledge. She established consistent patterns of nutrition, movement, and rest that reflected her values, recognizing that divine guidance often works through established rhythms rather than constant new revelations. Pope John Paul II taught that this maturation process follows the pattern we see throughout Scripture, where God gradually leads his people from more direct, obvious forms of communication toward more subtle, internalized wisdom. This doesn't mean God stops communicating, but rather that the relationship evolves toward greater partnership and co-creation. After several months in this spiritual desert, Maria began to recognize that divine communication hadn't actually stopped. It had simply changed form. Rather than dramatic synchronicities or clear inner promptings, guidance now came through the wisdom she had internalized, through the community that supported her spiritual journey, and through the values that had become deeply integrated into her being. This evolution reflects what Pope John Paul II called the communion of wisdom, a state where divine communication becomes so thoroughly integrated into our thinking and being that we naturally align with divine purposes without needing constant specific direction. Like an experienced dancer who no longer needs to count steps but moves naturally with the music, Maria found herself making decisions that reflected divine wisdom without conscious calculation. This transformation led her to one of the most significant discoveries of her journey. Divine communication isn't just for personal guidance, but for community transformation. Pope John Paul II consistently emphasized that authentic spiritual growth always expands outward, moving from personal illumination to communal application. With this understanding, Maria began gathering small groups of colleagues to discuss how their work as educators could more fully embody spiritual values. Rather than imposing her insights, she created spaces where others could share their own experiences of divine guidance. These conversations gradually expanded beyond spirituality to include questions of financial stewardship within their school system and health-supporting practices for both teachers and students. What began as one woman's journey to recognize divine communication became the catalyst for institutional change. The school where Maria taught gradually shifted toward more holistic educational practices that honored the spiritual, financial, and physical dimensions of both students' and teachers' lives. This outcome exemplifies one of Pope John Paul II's core teachings about divine communication. Its ultimate purpose is not just personal enlightenment, but the transformation of human communities to more fully reflect divine love and wisdom. Individual guidance should ultimately lead to collective flourishing. The impact on the school community was remarkable. Teachers reported greater job satisfaction and reduced burnout. Financial resources were allocated more effectively, with greater emphasis on long-term sustainability rather than short-term metrics. Students demonstrated improved academic outcomes alongside greater emotional resilience and social responsibility. This community transformation provides a powerful model for how the three miraculous signs of divine communication can ripple outward, creating circles of positive change. Pope John Paul II often spoke about this multiplying effect, where one person's attentiveness to divine guidance becomes a catalyst for wider awakening. Maria's experience also illuminates another important aspect of divine communication, that Pope John Paul II emphasized its cyclical rather than linear nature. Just as seasons follow one another in natural progression, our receptivity to divine signs often moves through different phases, each serving important purposes in our spiritual development. After her period of spiritual dryness, Maria entered a new season where divine communication returned in recognizable forms, but with important differences. The synchronicities she noticed now were subtler, requiring greater attentiveness. The peace she experienced during challenges had a deeper, more grounded quality. The persistent thoughts that guided her were less frequent, but more profound. This evolution reflects Pope John Paul II's teaching about spiritual maturation, where divine communication becomes simultaneously more subtle and more transformative as we develop greater spiritual sensitivity. Like a musician whose ear becomes trained to detect nuances in sound that others miss, spiritual maturation enhances our ability to discern divine guidance in increasingly refined ways. For Maria, this new season brought an important insight about financial wisdom. Pope John Paul II taught that as we mature spiritually, our relationship with material resources should increasingly reflect the divine economy, an economy of abundance, generosity, and trust rather than scarcity. Hoarding and fear. While basic financial responsibility remains important at every stage of spiritual development, Maria found that her maturing sensitivity to divine communication led her toward more courageous and creative approaches to resources. She began exploring collaborative economic models at her school, where teachers pooled certain resources to create greater collective security while reducing individual financial stress. This approach exemplifies what Pope John Paul II called the economy of communion, a vision of economic life that balances personal responsibility with communal care, reflecting the Trinity's perfect balance of distinct personhood within unbreakable unity. As Maria's spiritual perception matured, her financial practices naturally evolved toward this more integrated model. In terms of health, her developing sensitivity to divine communication led to what Pope John Paul II described as prophetic wellness, an approach to physical well-being that anticipates future needs rather than merely responding to current conditions. Through attentiveness to subtle interior guidance, Maria began making health choices that prepared her body for upcoming challenges before they fully manifested. For example, she felt a persistent prompting to strengthen her immune system through specific nutritional changes weeks before a severe flu season impacted her community. While many colleagues fell ill, Maria maintained her health and was able to provide support to others. This wasn't merely fortunate timing, but reflected her refined ability to recognize divine guidance regarding her physical well-being. This prophetic dimension of divine communication extends to all areas of life. Pope John Paul II taught that God often provides guidance not just for present circumstances, but for future challenges and opportunities. As we develop greater sensitivity to the three miraculous signs, we may receive insights that only fully reveal their significance with the passage of time. Maria experienced this when she felt prompted to develop certain teaching skills that seemed unnecessary in her current position. Months later, when her school underwent unexpected restructuring, these precise skills positioned her for a leadership role she couldn't have anticipated. This experience taught her that divine communication often operates with a longer time horizon than our immediate concerns, preparing us for futures we cannot yet envision. This forward-looking aspect of divine guidance applies powerfully to financial decisions. Pope John Paul II emphasized that authentic financial wisdom balances immediate needs with long-term stewardship, considering not just personal, but intergenerational well-being. As Maria's sensitivity to divine communication matured, her financial planning naturally extended to longer time frames and broader concerns. She began considering how her financial choices impacted not just her own future, but the economic and environmental realities future generations would inherit. This expanded perspective led to more sustainable consumption patterns, more thoughtful investment decisions, and greater generosity toward causes addressing long-term social challenges. Similarly, her approach to health evolved to incorporate this longer view. Beyond immediate physical well-being, she began considering how her health practices might support vitality and purpose through different life stages. Inspired by Pope John Paul II's example of remaining spiritually and intellectually engaged despite physical limitations in his later years, she developed health practices aimed at supporting lifelong meaning and contribution rather than merely extending lifespan. As Maria's journey continued to unfold, she encountered another profound teaching from Pope John Paul II about divine communication, its paradoxical nature. Authentic divine guidance often contains seeming contradictions that, when embraced rather than resolved, lead to greater wisdom than either extreme alone could provide. For example, divine communication frequently guides us toward both prudent planning and radical trust, both disciplined effort and peaceful surrender, both personal responsibility and communal interdependence. Rather than choosing between these apparently opposing values, mature spiritual wisdom learns to hold them in creative tension. Maria discovered this paradoxical quality in her financial life when divine guidance led her toward both greater economic simplicity and more abundant generosity. Logic might suggest that reducing one's consumption would limit one's ability to give, yet Maria found that simplifying certain aspects of her lifestyle actually created more resources for sharing with others. This discovery mirrors Pope John Paul II's teaching on the paradox of divine abundance, the spiritual principle that certain forms of apparent reduction actually create increase. We see this throughout Scripture, from the multiplication of loaves and fishes to Jesus' teaching that those who lose their life for his sake will find it. In her health journey, Maria similarly encountered paradoxical guidance that transformed her approach to well-being. During a period of health challenges, she received seemingly contradictory promptings, both to rest more completely and to engage more fully in certain forms of service to others. Conventional wisdom might suggest focusing exclusively on recovery before helping others, yet Maria found that the right balance of restful self-care and meaningful contribution to others actually accelerated her healing. This experience reflects Pope John Paul II's teaching on the healing power of self-gift, the paradoxical reality that appropriate forms of service to others can bring healing to the giver. His own life exemplified this principle as he continued his papal ministry despite significant physical limitations, finding that his service to others gave him strength beyond medical explanation. These paradoxes extend to community life as well, as Maria's spiritually informed approach influenced her school. They discovered that structures providing both clear boundaries and genuine flexibility created more thriving than either rigid order or complete freedom alone. This balance reflects Pope John Paul II's teaching on the freedom of divine order, the recognition that authentic freedom flourishes within appropriate structures rather than in their absence. One of the most significant developments in Maria's ongoing journey with divine communication was her growing recognition of what Pope John Paul II called the sacramentality of ordinary life, the awareness that everyday experiences can become vessels of divine presence and communication when approached with spiritual attentiveness. Ordinary conversations with colleagues sometimes carried insights that addressed questions she had been pondering for weeks. Routine tasks like organizing her classroom occasionally brought surprising clarity about personal dilemmas. Even mundane activities like waiting in line at the grocery store sometimes became opportunities for meaningful connections that carried divine guidance. This sacramental perspective transformed Maria's experience of daily life from a series of tasks to be completed into a continuous unfolding of potential divine encounters. Pope John Paul II taught that this shift in perception represents one of the most significant fruits of spiritual maturation. The ability to recognize divine presence and communication, not just in obviously spiritual contexts, but in the fabric of ordinary existence. This awareness particularly transformed Maria's relationship with money and material possessions. Rather than seeing financial resources as merely practical tools, she began recognizing them as potential sacraments, visible carriers of invisible grace when used with spiritual intention. This perspective led to more mindful earning, spending, saving, and giving, with each financial action becoming an opportunity for communion with divine purposes. Similarly, her approach to health evolved from primarily functional concerns to sacramental awareness. Physical care became not just maintenance of her body, but an expression of gratitude for the gift of embodiment. Nutrition became not just fuel, but communion with the created order that sustains us. Movement became not just exercise, but celebration of the divine gift of mobility and strength. This sacramental perspective represents what Pope John Paul II described as mature spiritual vision, the ability to perceive divine presence and purpose in all dimensions of human experience. This vision doesn't separate life into sacred and secular compartments, but recognizes the potential for divine communication through every aspect of existence. As Maria continued developing this sacramental awareness, she discovered another important teaching from Pope John Paul II about divine communication, its invitation to creative participation. Mature spiritual receptivity doesn't just receive divine guidance passively but actively co-creates with it, bringing our unique gifts and perspectives into dialogue with divine wisdom. This co-creative dimension became particularly evident in Maria's professional life. Rather than simply implementing educational approaches others had developed, she began creating innovative teaching methods that integrated spiritual principles with evidence-based practices. These innovations emerged from the convergence of divine guidance and her own professional expertise, resulting in approaches neither she nor others could have developed alone. Pope John Paul II described this co-creative process as the divine-human partnership, the mysterious collaboration, where divine communication provides direction and inspiration, while human creativity provides implementation and expression. This partnership honors both divine wisdom and human agency, creating space for genuine innovation within spiritual guidance. In her financial life, this co-creative dimension led Maria to develop unique approaches to resource stewardship that addressed the specific needs of her community. Rather than simply adopting financial practices others recommended, she created customized approaches that integrated spiritual principles with practical realities in ways particularly suited to educational contexts. Regarding health, the co-creative aspect of divine communication inspired Maria to develop wellness practices specifically designed for teachers. Practices that address the unique physical and emotional demands of education while honoring spiritual principles of holistic well-being. These approaches weren't merely adaptations of existing health protocols, but genuine innovations emerging from the integration of divine guidance with professional insight. This co-creative relationship with divine communication represents what Pope John Paul II called mature spiritual agency, the capacity to work with divine guidance as active partners rather than passive recipients. This maturity doesn't diminish reliance on divine wisdom, but actually deepens it, creating space for more nuanced and contextual applications of spiritual principles. As Maria's journey continued to unfold, her experiences with divine communication gradually transformed not just specific aspects of her life, but her entire understanding of human purpose. Pope John Paul II taught that the ultimate aim of divine communication isn't just to guide our decisions, but to shape our identity, to form us into people whose very being reflects divine character. This formation happens gradually as we recognize and respond to the three miraculous signs. Divine coincidences teach us to perceive meaning and connection in what others might dismiss as random. Inner peace during turmoil develops our capacity to trust beyond circumstances. Persistent, holy thoughts cultivate steadfast attention to what truly matters. Over time, these repeated encounters with divine communication transform not just what we do, but who we are. We become, as Pope John Paul II described it, living letters, people whose lives communicate divine wisdom to others, even without words. Maria began to experience this transformation as colleagues, students, and even casual acquaintances reported that interactions with her brought them unexpected clarity, courage, or comfort. Without intentionally trying to guide others, her presence itself had become a form of divine communication, a living demonstration of the integration of spirituality, wisdom, and wholeness that can emerge through attentiveness to divine guidance. This transformation represents what Pope John Paul II called incarnational spirituality, the process whereby divine communication gradually becomes embodied in human lives, making spiritual realities visible and tangible in the physical world. Like Jesus himself, who perfectly embodied divine communication in human form, we are called to become living expressions of divine wisdom and love. This incarnational quality extends to our relationship with material resources. As Maria's receptivity to divine communication matured. Her financial practices increasingly embodied spiritual principles in tangible ways. Her budgeting reflected values of sufficiency and sharing rather than excess and hoarding. Her spending patterns prioritized relational wealth over material accumulation. Her giving demonstrated generosity without seeking recognition. In terms of health, the incarnational dimension manifested through bodily practices that expressed spiritual realities. Her nutrition choices reflected reverence for creation and gratitude for provision. Her movement patterns celebrated the gift of embodiment, rather than pursuing cultural ideals of appearance. Her rest practices honored human limitations and the divine rhythm of work and renewal. This embodiment of divine wisdom in everyday practices represents what Pope John Paul II called lived theology, the expression of spiritual truth. Through practical choices rather than merely intellectual assent, true receptivity to divine communication ultimately transforms not just our beliefs, but our embodied existence in the world. As we conclude our exploration of the three miraculous signs that Pope John Paul II revealed about divine communication, I invite you to consider how these insights might transform your own relationship with God, your approach to resources, and your understanding of well-being. Imagine a life where you regularly recognize divine coincidences that guide your path. Envision maintaining peace even during life's inevitable challenges because you sense God's presence within the storm. Consider how your life might change if you learn to recognize and respond to those persistent holy thoughts that nudge you toward your truest purpose. This journey toward greater receptivity to divine communication doesn't require special spiritual gifts or dramatic mystical experiences. As Pope John Paul II consistently taught, God desires communication with all his children and provides multiple pathways for this sacred dialogue. The three miraculous signs we've explored: divine coincidences, peace during turmoil, and holy persistence are available to anyone willing to develop the spiritual attentiveness they require. This attentiveness grows through simple, consistent practices, moments of silence that create space for divine whispers, reflection on daily experiences to notice patterns of guidance, and communities of shared discernment that help us test and refine what we're hearing. Maria's story illustrates the transformative power of recognizing these signs. What began as her personal journey to discern divine guidance became a catalyst for community renewal, demonstrating that receptivity to divine communication naturally extends outward, creating ripples of positive change in our relationships, work environments, and wider communities. As you continue your own spiritual journey, remember Pope John Paul II's encouraging words. God speaks not just to saints and mystics, but to every human heart that creates space for divine whispers. Your own life, with its unique circumstances and challenges, is a sacred context for divine communication. The invitation before each of us is simple yet profound: to develop greater attentiveness to the ways God is already speaking in our lives, through divine coincidences that seem too meaningful to be random, through peace that transcends our circumstances, through persistent thoughts that align with love and truth. As we recognize and respond to these miraculous signs, we participate in the great conversation that has sustained humanity throughout history. The ongoing dialogue between divine wisdom and human experience that guides us toward our truest purpose and deepest fulfillment. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Pope John Paul II's profound teachings on divine communication. May you recognize the ways God is speaking in your own life, finding guidance for your spiritual journey, wisdom for your resource stewardship, and wholeness in your approach to well-being. And remember, the most miraculous aspect of divine communication isn't the signs themselves, but the extraordinary reality they point to. We are never alone in our journey. Divine wisdom, love, and guidance are constantly available to those with hearts open to receive them. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Have you noticed any of these three miraculous signs in your own life? How has divine communication influenced your approach to spirituality, finances, or health? Share your insights in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation together. Until next time, may you walk in the awareness that God is constantly speaking words of wisdom, guidance, and love into your life. All you need to do is learn to recognize the signs,